Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Books and Books here in Coral Gables. We are live on the internet here. We like to call this the cultural heart of the city. My name is Steve. On behalf of everyone here at the bookstore, welcome. While you're silencing your cell phones, please pick up a copy of our Books and Books newsletter. This will give you a synopsis of all the wonderful events we have here at Books and Books just about every night of the week. We have Spanish events, we have kids events, poetry readings, first-time authors, celebrity signings. Couple of note, well, actually one of note, Martin Amis will be here on Sunday. We have tickets on sale for that and the book for sale for that event. That'll be taking place here in the store on Sunday, and it is going to be live streamed as well. So if you're not available to come to the store, you can always go to our website and watch it. And I would also point out that we do have some cameras around the store as we are live streaming, and there are some that are pointed at the audience for the question and answer period. So for the benefit of those that may be watching anywhere in the world on the internet, please make sure you're sitting next to who you're supposed to be sitting next to. As I say, there is always an event for everyone's taste, and pick up a copy this tonight when you're buying your copy of Charlie Lovett's book. I also remind you that flash photography interferes a bit with the live stream, so if you could refrain from that, we'd appreciate it. So go to our website. Also, if you're here in the store, you can go to our website and give us your email address. That way we can alert you to everything that's going on. And during the event that's in progress, live streaming, you can always give us a call here at the store, and we'll get you a signed autographed book and ship it to you free of charge, the shipping anyway. And you can also call and ask a question of the author while the event is in progress. But tonight we're very happy to have with us Charlie Lovett and his new book, First Impressions. It's a thrilling literary mystery from the New York Times bestselling author, Charlie Lovett. Charlie's first delighted readers with his New York Times bestselling debut, The Bookman's Tale. Now Lovett weaves another brilliantly imagined mystery, this time featuring one of English literature's most popular and beloved authors, Jane Austen. Lovett weaves a romantic, suspenseful, and utterly compelling novel about love in all its forms and the joys of a life lived in books. Charlie is also a playwright who loves books, old and new. The Bookman's Tale is set in the world of rare books, a world he learned all about during his years as an antiquarian bookseller and book collector. His plays for children have been seen in over 3,000 productions worldwide, and he loves hearing from students and teachers who are involved in producing his plays. He worked more than a decade at Summit School in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. We're very happy to have him with us this evening. Please welcome Charlie Lovett.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Thank you for watching. It's exciting to be here. I think this is the first time I've been on the internet live, so a new experience for me. So this is my new book that we're going to talk about today, First Impressions. And the way I like to sort of title this talk is Judging a Book by Its Cover, because that's exactly what I was taught never to do, and so I thought this would be a great thing to do. And the way I'm going to do that is sort of deconstruct some of these elements that you see on the cover of the book and use that as a means of getting into a discussion about the book itself. So the book is called First Impressions, and there are two storylines in First Impressions. One is a storyline set in the present day, and I have to say I was a little bit nervous about setting a storyline in the present day, because if you know anything about writing and publishing, you know that I wrote this book almost 2 years ago, and I was just crossing my fingers and saying, please let there still be texting 2 years from now. You just never know, things change so quickly. And that is the story of a young woman named Sophie Collingwood, who you'll hear more about later on, and a mystery that she gets involved in involving a rare book and Jane Austen. And speaking of Jane Austen, the second story in the book is set in 1796. And the main character in that story is a young Jane Austen. She's 20 years old, and she is working on the first drafts of the novels that will become Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, and Northanger Abbey. Now, I don't know what you were doing when you were 20 years old, but when I was 20 years old, all right, we're going to go on to the next slide now. Let's see here. So the subtitle of this book, which we will spend some time parsing, if you live in the United States, which most of you look like you do, or Canada, it's called A Novel of Old Books, Unexpected Love, and Jane Austen. If you happen to live in the United Kingdom, Australia, or New Zealand, it's called A Novel of Old Books, Young Love, and Jane Austen. But either way, there's obviously three things that we need to talk about. And the first one is this young lady right here, Jane Austen. She's a little bit of the white elephant in the room when people come to talk about my book. That's the first thing that everybody wants to hear about. And there's a couple of things you might want to know about Jane Austen. First of all, here she is. We're gonna assume that this is her down in the bottom corner of the book, talking to her friend Richard Mansfield, who I'll tell you about in just a minute. But here's Jane herself. Jane Austen was a real person. She lived from 1775 to 1817. She apparently wrote some books. And she, in my book, meets a gentleman named Richard Mansfield, who was not a real person and who did not live from 1716 to 1796. A good way you can tell that he's not a real person is that I have this lovely photograph of him here tonight, in spite of the fact that photography wasn't invented until 40 years after he died. So when I decided that Jane Austen was going to be a part of this book, that sort of gave me the challenge of how do you write Jane Austen as a character? And it may seem that the obvious way to do that is to read a bunch of big fat biographies, but that's exactly what I didn't want to do. I did want to be sure that I got the factual details of her life correct, in that I wanted her to be living in the right place at the right time. I wanted her to be writing her novels at the time that she really wrote her novels. And I wanted to get the names of her family members correct and those sorts of things. But I didn't want to get too hung up on the minutiae of her biography. So instead, to write her as a character, I returned to the novels. And especially to these three novels, Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, and Northanger Abbey, which, as I've said, really enter into my own particular narrative. And I read them again, and I asked myself, what kind of person would write a novel like this in the 1790s or the early 1800s? And to me, the answer to that question was, first of all, someone with a great sense of humor, very witty, very quick on her feet, extremely intelligent, really keenly aware of interpersonal relationships, sort of quietly revolutionary, and not afraid to be an assertive woman in a world that's pretty much run by men. And I hope that's the way that she comes across in the novel. That's certainly what I was going for. The other thing I did to get ready to write Jane Austen is I visited some of the places where she lived her life, and in particular Steventon, which is where she lived the first 25 years of her life, and which is where most of my Jane Austen scenes are set. Steventon's a tiny little village in Hampshire, which my wife and daughter were kind enough to let me detour to when we were on our way to visit Highclere Castle, which of course is better known as Downton Abbey. By the way, that's not real either, just in case you were wondering. I have it on good authority that Lord and Lady Grantham are fictional characters. So we went early so I could go to Steventon. And there's not much to see there. This is the little church in Steventon where Jane Austen's father was the rector for about 40 years. And it's about all that remains in the village from her time there. But as soon as I stepped into this churchyard, there was this peacefulness, and it was this beautiful morning, and I just instantly thought, this is where Jane's story needs to begin. It's where she spent her first great creative period in the mid-1790s, and it's where I felt like I really wanted to start my story. And so my story begins underneath this yew tree that you see on the right-hand side of the picture, your left, my right. And now the yew tree today we think is about 900 years old. So I'm going to ask you to use your imagination as I'm reading and imagine that it is just a small sprig of 700 years old, because that's what it would have been when Jane Austen was there. So what I'd like to do by way of introduction to Miss Austen and Mr. Mansfield is read you the first scene where they meet each other. This is only on the second page of the book, so it's not too much of a spoiler. Jane has been walking in the countryside the day before, and she's seen this mysterious figure, this elderly clergyman, sitting on a stile reading a book, and she's sort of formed some preconceived notions about him. So we might call them first impressions even. And this is what happens when she finally meets him. She sees him in church on Sunday morning, and she meets him underneath this yew tree. Miss Jane Austen, if I'm not mistaken. You are at an advantage, sir, said Jane. You know my name, but I do not know yours. Mansfield. Reverend Richard Mansfield, at your service, he said with a slight bow. But we have nearly met already. What can you mean, sir? Only that 2 days ago you emerged from the waving grain of Lord Winteringham's field and stopped in your tracks when you spotted me reading on a stile just outside Busbury Park. At the time I conceived the idea that you are a rather dull and impetuous young lady, but I already begin to suspect that I may have been mistaken. His eyes twinkled in the morning sun as he said this, and his smile transformed from one meant for the general public to one that seemed to be reserved solely for Jane. I hope you will come to believe so, Mr. Mansfield. I have been accused of having many faults by those who know me well, but neither dullness nor impetuousness has been among them. And what faults do they accuse you of? My worst, or so I am told, are a too highly developed interest in fictionalizing my acquaintances, and a tendency to form opinions of others hastily. Opinions such as the one you formed of me when you saw me alone with my book. You do me wrong, sir. You assume, first, that I saw you, second, that I gave your appearance sufficient thought to form an opinion, and third, that my opinion was ill-considered. In the first case, said Mr. Mansfield, I observed you myself, for though your mind may have been elsewhere, your eyes were certainly on me. In the second case, Your father tells me, somewhat to my surprise, that you aspire to write novels. So I can only assume that anyone you meet may become a victim of your imagination. And in the third case, it seems impossible that you would have guessed the extent to which our interests overlap. I confess that shared interest did not occur to me. I imagined you a student of natural history, reading, but you will laugh when I tell you. I enjoy a good laugh, said Mr. Mansfield. I imagined you reading a book on garden slugs. Mr. Mansfield did laugh long and heartily before confessing the true nature of his reading. It may shock you, Miss Austen, but in fact, I was reading a novel. A novel? You do shock me, sir. Do you not find novels full of nonsense? I myself find them the stupidest things in creation. Then you read novels? Novels. I'm surprised at you, Mr. Mansfield, suggesting that a young lady such as myself, the daughter of a clergyman no less, could occupy her time with such horrid things as novels. You tease me, Miss Austen. Indeed, I do not, Mr. Mansfield, for though you know that I aspire to write novels, you cannot expect that I would take my interest in the form so far as to actually read them. Because Mr. Mansfield was old enough to be her grandfather, Jane took the bold step of adding a wink to this statement and turned toward the rectory. The congregation had dispersed, and only the sounds of bird song and the breeze in the yew tree disturbed the silence of the morning. Jane was pleased when Mr. Mansfield fell into step beside her as she made her way up the tree-lined lane. With the summer sun now high in the sky, she was grateful for the cooling shade. Surely, Mr. Mansfield, your shortest route to Busbury Park lies in the opposite direction, said Jane. Indeed it does, but you're assuming again, Miss Austen. First, that I am staying at the park, and second, that I am taking my luncheon there. And my novelist's imagination has deceived me again? Not entirely, said Mr. Mansfield, for I am a guest at Busbury Park. But though he can offer me only cold mutton, your father has asked me to take my luncheon at the rectory. I confess, Mr. Mansfield, I am sorry to hear it. And why is that? Are you so embarrassed to be seen in the company of a novel reader? On the contrary, it is because you are a novel reader that I had rather hoped to keep you to myself. Once you enter the doors of the rectory, you will become a friend to my mother and my sister Cassandra, and you will no doubt retire after lunch to the study with my father and abandon the rest of us. Surely, Miss Austen, said Mr. Mansfield, I can be both a visitor at the rectory and a special friend of the rector's younger daughter. I believe, Mr. Mansfield, said Jane as she took the clergyman's arm, that I should like that, very much indeed. And so that's when these two characters, one fictional and one not so fictional, meet. And where they meet, of course, is, wait for it, in a novel. So I thought it was interesting, as I've been having this interesting experience in the last few weeks that the translated editions of my first novel, The Bookman's Tale, have started to arrive on my doorstep. I found it especially interesting when I received a copy of the Czech edition from my agent, and it had in it a little note, "Dear Charlie, here's the Czech edition of The Bookman's Tale. Please let us know if you have any questions." And I thought, what questions can I possibly have? They have apparently great confidence in my ability with the Czech language. But I did notice that very often the word novel in the languages that my book is being translated into is rendered roman. And I pulled out my trusty 13 volumes of the Oxford English Dictionary and discovered that actually these two words meant more or less the same thing until fairly recently. The idea of romance being all about wooing and courtship is a fairly new thing. It simply used to mean sort of a romance was just kind of a long story or a tale, just as we think of a novel as being. Now this made me feel better about the fact that The Bookman's Tale, which has been put in various different genres by various different people who put books into genres, including historical fiction and literary mystery, but one of the genres it's got put in by Amazon in their little ebook list is historical romance. And it's been in the top 25 of their historical romance ebooks almost since it came out. And I'm very proud to say that it's the only one of the top 25 in which all the characters on the cover appear fully clothed. I checked right before I came on tour. I thought it would be interesting to see how the book was doing, you know, the first book. And so right before me on the list is When the Duke Was Wicked. And right after me on the list is The Bride Says No. So I'm obviously keeping very lofty company. So let's go back to our cover and see what the next element is. And it's this young woman up here in the corner. And I like to believe that this is our modern heroine, Sophie Collingwood. Now Sophie, very much like Richard Mansfield, is a fictional character. And she is the lead character in a novel called First Impressions. So as you heard in the first piece that I read you, you can sort of sense that this novel is going to be a little bit about the first impressions that people have of people and the ways that they guide us both correctly and incorrectly. And that might remind you of another novel that you may have read sometime called Pride and Prejudice, which is also very much about faulty or not so faulty first impressions. And in fact, the original working title of Pride and Prejudice was First Impressions. Oh, sorry, I've gone too far. So I thought, since Jane Austen didn't use the title, I would just pick it up off of her cutting room floor and use it myself. My agent said to me, do you think that Jane Austen aficionados will recognize that as an Austen title? And I said, hang on, let me check for you. I'm going to do a little bit of research. So I hung up the phone. I called my father, who taught 18th century English lit for 40 years. I said, what was the working title of Pride and Prejudice? And he said, First Impressions. Why? I said, no reason. And I hung up and I called my agent back and I said, yep, they'll know. So Sophie is the main character in this novel, Pride and Prejudice. And she, of course, also has first impressions of people that she meets. She meets a number of people. One of the people that she meets might be sort of a Darcy character. One of them might be sort of a Wickham character. And hopefully, if I've done my job right, you'll figure out which one is which before Sophie does. Because I kind of love the idea that the reader is cheering the protagonist along in a certain direction and is, at least in cases of love and romance, maybe slightly ahead of a 25-year-old who is still trying to sort of find her way in the world and understand the ways of 25 to 35-year-old men, which are ways that I personally don't understand. So what luck could Sophie possibly have? So I'm going to read you now Sophie's first scene, where she first appears to us. We get our first impressions of her as readers, and she gets her first impressions of a young man that she meets while she's walking along the riverside. Oxfordshire, present day. Oh, I'm going the wrong way again. After 5 years at Oxford, Sophie Collingwood had mastered the art of reading while walking. She knew every curve of the Thames path from Oxford to Godstow, and had the ability to sense and avoid oncoming pedestrians. This was a useful skill for someone so absorbed by the books she read that she often pictured herself at the center of whatever romance or mystery or adventure played out on their pages. On a sunny day in July, she was walking opposite the wide expanse of Port Meadow, where horses and cattle stood grazing as they had for centuries. On the river, a quartet of picnickers were making their way back downstream in a punt, and the smooth sound of the flat-bottomed boat gliding across the water seemed the perfect accompaniment to the day. In the midst of this idyll, Sophie spotted, over the top of her well-worn copy of Mansfield Park, a young man lying under a tree, reading. His artfully relaxed sprawl and his intentionally disheveled clothes radiated a combination of arrogance and apathy. Slovenly would be the best word to describe him, she decided. The unwashed hair, the shredded jeans, the faded t-shirt. It was a style that both puzzled and annoyed her. Sure, Sophie didn't always go out of her way to look good, but to go out of the way to look bad just seemed rude. As she drew level with him, he greeted her in a lazy American voice. "How's it going?" he asked, but Sophie only raised her book higher and walked on, pretending his question had been lost in the breeze. As she rounded the next bend in the river and was lost to sight, she had a sudden recollection. She had heard that voice before. It had been 2 nights ago at the Bear. She had been standing at the bar waiting to order drinks for a group of friends who were discussing the relative merits of Mansfield Park and Persuasion, when the brash American accent had cut through the clamor of the crowd. What really gets me is these Austen fangirls running around pretending the sun rises and sets with some chick who wrote soap operas 200 years ago. And then in a mocking imitation of an English girl, he had added, "I think Mansfield Park isn't properly appreciated by the establishment." Sophie had crossed back to the table with her drinks, and the sound of his voice had been blessedly swallowed up by the noise of the crowd, but the damage had been done. For it had been Sophie who had made the remark about Mansfield Park, not 5 minutes earlier. When she told her friends what she had heard, they had all had a good laugh about the whole thing, and had quickly come to the conclusion that this conceited American was a prat. After a half pint of bitter in the Garden of the Trout, Sophie headed back toward Oxford. It would take her just over an hour to walk the 4 miles to Christchurch, and that should be enough time, she thought, to see Fanny and Edmund married. But just as things were beginning to look inevitable for the 2 young lovers, Sophie heard once again that insufferable voice. "What you readin'?" it asked, as Sophie approached. He spoke louder this time, and she couldn't pretend she hadn't heard. Not that it's any of your business, said Sophie, but I happen to be reading Jane Austen. The person, be a gentleman or lady, who's not pleasure in a good novel must be intolerably stupid. Sophie was so taken aback that she almost smiled in spite of herself. After his comments in The Bear, the last thing she expected from him was a Jane Austen quote. Surprised to hear me say that? It's just that that's a rather obscure Austen quote for a what? Asked the man. An unsophisticated, uncultured, unenlightened dilettante? That's not what I meant, said Sophie. It's just that most people haven't read Northanger Abbey. Exactly. And you're surprised, since I'm not wearing tweed or sitting in a dusty study, that I have the first idea about Austen. On the contrary, she said politely, I think lounging on the banks of the Thames on a summer day is the perfect way to read Austen. Well, to be fair, there are two reasons I can quote that passage so precisely. First, I saw it on a T-shirt in the Bodleian shop yesterday, so it's not as obscure as you think. Sophie could barely conceal her irritation at this. And the second reason, she said icily. He held up a battered paperback copy of Northanger Abbey. I just read it about 10 seconds before you walked up. I'm Eric Hall. He extended his hand without raising himself off the ground, simultaneously tossing his hair out of his eyes. Sophie fought to keep her face from betraying that she already knew he was a jerk. And yet she sensed that behind his studied appearance and almost scripted insolence, there was something softer. It wasn't just that he read Jane Austen. It was the way he waited for her response with almost painful anticipation, like a little boy seeking approval. Sophie, she said, offering her hand, but not her surname. Pleasure to meet you. Is it really? Said Sophie. I thought you didn't care for Austen fangirls. So that's the first place that we meet Eric. And usually when a young man and a young woman meet in a novel at the beginning, you can sort of expect that there might be some fireworks by the end. And so you might think that that brings us to the next topic, which, as I said, is called Unexpected Love on this side of the ocean and Young Love on the other side of the ocean. And it was an interesting battle over the subtitle, and I was sort of torn both ways because old books, Young Love, just sounds good. It works. It's a nice rhythm. There's a yin and a yang to it. But on the other hand, Unexpected Love was much more what I was trying to get at with this novel. Because although there is a traditional romantic story with Sophie and a couple of young men who are vying for her attention, I wanted to explore the idea that there are a lot of kinds of love besides that. Now, if you want to do an interesting little experiment, you can go on a Google and do a search on the word love. I encourage you to put your filter on before you do this. But I did this, and these are some of the images that came up. And I realized that these are, all from the sort of the most popular images. And I realized that when we think of love, way too often we think of two young people walking on the beach at sunset. I'm sure this is probably somewhere near here where that picture was taken. And I was really interested in exploring some of the other aspects of love, as David Garnett calls it in his wonderful novel. And in particular, the two relationships in First Impressions that become very loving relationships have nothing to do with romance or courtship or wooing or sexuality. And they, of course, involve my two heroines, Jane Austen and Sophie Collingwood. Now, you won't be surprised to hear that Jane Austen's relationship is with the Reverend Richard Mansfield. He is a little bit of a writer himself. He has written a little book of allegories intended for the aid of late 18th century preachers. It's almost as riveting as it sounds. And he recognizes that he's no great talent as a writer, but he also recognizes that Jane Austen is a great talent as a writer, even as a 20-year-old. And he befriends her, and they begin to talk together about literature and about writing. They read to each other, and he advises her on her writing, and he critiques her work. And she realizes, when she's separated from him a few months after they meet for the first time, that in a completely unromantic way, she's very much in love with this man. And here's what she says. There could be no doubt about the matter. Jane loved Mr. Mansfield, not with the love of a heroine for a hero, but with a love that was slower and gentler, more intellectual than passionate, the word avuncular occurred to her, but though she certainly loved her uncles, her relationship with them was nothing like that with Mr. Mansfield. With him there was a meeting of the minds that she supposed was rare even between husbands and wives. It was as if a part of her mind dwelt in him and a part of his mind dwelt in her, and when she was separated from him, a part of herself was missing. So for Sophie, that person is her Uncle Bertram, played, one would hope in the film, by the great Stephen Fry. I just can't see anybody else playing Uncle Bertram. So Sophie grows up in a big English country house that has one of these grand libraries at the middle of the house, but it's a library that is locked all the time, and she's never able to have access to it. Now, if you want to know why the library is locked all the time, this is something you'll find out probably about 2:30 tomorrow morning when you're up reading the book, because you absolutely can't put it down. So I don't want to spoil that part of it for you. But because she doesn't really have access to much in the way of books in her own home, it is her Uncle Bertram who introduces her to this world. He invites her to come to the theater with him in London when she's about 8 years old, and it's the first time she goes to visit him in his flat, and his flat is completely filled with books from floor to ceiling in every room. And through her Uncle Bertram, Sophie suddenly discovers this world of stories and literature and leather binding and worn cloth spines and cracked yellow paper, and she falls deeply, deeply in love with that world, and of course with her incredible uncle. Now, Uncle Bertram does this amazing thing for Sophie. Every year at Christmas, starting when she's 8 years old, she gets to come to his flat, and she can search all over the flat, high and low, shelves under the bed, any place she wants to look, and any book she wants, she can take with her as her Christmas present. Now, I've had several people who read the book before it came out, whose first response to me, before they said whether they liked the book or anything else, was, "I want an Uncle Bertram." I think we could all sort of use an Uncle Bertram. And of course, it's Uncle Bertram who introduces Sophie to this world of old books, which brings us to, working backwards, the first item in our subtitle. Sophie is just out of Oxford, and she goes to work at an antiquarian bookstore in London. And the mystery that begins for her happens when two different customers come in, and they're asked for the same copy of the same book, a second edition of Richard Mansfield's Little Book of Allegories. And the reason I wanted to make it the second edition is because in book collecting, there's so much focus on the first edition. And I notice I have to take some of my fellow writers to task just slightly here without naming names. And that is simply that you can always tell a writer who's writing about, a book lover, but the writer doesn't really collect books or understand them, because they'll always say, he had a library of leather-bound first editions. Now, you're sitting in a room full of first editions, and none of them are leather-bound. And I guarantee you, there's a book in this room somewhere that'll be worth $10,000 10 years from now. If you know which one it is, then you're really astute. It's probably First Impressions. I mean, that'd be my guess, but I'm just guessing. So I wanted to explore this idea. I had this idea of, what if there was a book where the second edition was priceless and the first edition was a worthless piece of junk? Why might that be? And that sort of led me into this mystery of the book that Sophie tries to find and discovers is somehow connected to Jane Austen. And the search for this book and the reaction to what she finds in this book leads her into great peril, but also to, I hope, great excitement. So there are two old books that are sort of in the center of our story. One of them is this one, the first edition of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I was lucky enough at my book launch event in North Carolina last week to actually have a first edition of Pride and Prejudice loaned by the Rare Book library across the street. Unfortunately, they would not let me bring it on tour. I don't know why. It's a 3-volume book, as you can see. I only wanted to take 1 volume. I don't know what the problem was. Now, the other book is Richard Mansfield's Little Book of Allegories, which of course is a fictional book that I made up. However, I sort of brought a copy of it with me. Since I couldn't bring Jane Austen, I brought the closest thing I could to Richard Mansfield. This is a book a book of allegories from the late 18th century. I wanted to excerpt some of Richard Mansfield's writings in First Impressions so that people could sort of compare him with Jane Austen, and so that Sophie could learn a little bit about them, and he would read to Jane Austen back and forth. And so I wanted something that really, really felt like a late 18th century allegorical story written as an aid to preaching kind of thing. And I thought, the best way to make it sound completely authentic would simply be to steal an 18th century allegorical story. And so I found this book called, I have to read you the title of this book. While I'm reading this title, keep in mind, this is a children's book. It's called The Selector, being a new and chaste collection of visions, tales, and allegories calculated for the amusement and instruction of the rising generation. Disney film yet to be released. And it has these allegorical stories in it. And so that's the book from which I took the excerpts of Richard Mansfield's writing that appear. And one of the things I wanted to do with that was to challenge us as readers. And if you're here, you're probably a reader. And if you're listening to me, you're probably a reader of novels. Because I think often as readers of novels, we tend to view the past through the lens of our favorite novels. If I ask you about, what the Regency period in England was like, there's a pretty good chance you're going to just start thinking about Jane Austen novels. Many of us will. If you were to ask Sophie Collingwood, what was the Regency period like? She would her eyes would roll back in her head and she would have goosebumps and she would just say, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife." Because Sophie Collingwood, that's her favorite line in all of literature. In case you're wondering what that line looked like the very first time anybody other than Jane Austen laid eyes on it, that's what it looked like right there. It's pretty impressive to see that line taking up almost a third of the page. When Sophie has her encounter with the first edition of Pride and Prejudice, it is a major emotional moment for her. But there are other first lines in the world besides that one. So let me read you a Richard Mansfield first line. By the way, The Selector is an anonymous book, so therefore I know I'm not offending any of you by reading your great-great-grandfather's book. "When the original chaos was first reduced to form, and primeval darkness and confusion were superseded by light and harmony, the gods joined together exercise and temperance, and sent them down among mortals to facilitate and hasten the population of the new world." Children's book, let me just say one more time. So here's the reaction that Sophie has when she comes face to face with that particular sentence. "When she read Jane Austen, Sophie felt transported back 200 years and found herself in a place and time she loved to inhabit, attending balls, taking walks in the countryside, paying visits, and all in the company of witty and charming heroines. Reading Richard Mansfield, she found herself in the same era, yet in the company of people so dull they would pay actual money to own and read these dreadful stories. It made her want to run screaming back to the present. How could two such different authors, united by a desire to write fiction, both represent the same world? In a way, slogging through Richard Mansfield was a revelation to Sophie. We judge the past, if we are readers of novels, only by the output of the best writers, she thought. How differently might we feel if instead of viewing the turn of the 19th century through the lens of Jane Austen, we viewed it through the lens of Richard Mansfield. So those are the old books. Now, let's go back to our cover one more time, because there's one more little story I want to tell you about this cover. And that is about the house that you see down at the bottom. Now, I got the cover, in a PDF file, and I thought this looks great, and we made a few tweaks. I had actually seen it in my editor's office, and we were really happy about the cover. I loved the way it sort of echoed the cover of The Bookman's Tale without really sort of copying it completely. And I thought, and it's great because we have this fictional estate, Busbury Park, and they found a nice painting of an old English estate and slapped it on the bottom, and there it is, the fictional Busbury Park. So we get the book all done, it's off to the printers, and my wife and I head off to England for 3 weeks in late April and early May. We have a cottage over in Oxfordshire. And I decide, well, I'm going to do some traveling to start researching the next book, but I also need to backtrack and do a little bit of Jane Austen visiting. Because the only time I'd ever been to Chawton, which is where Jane Austen lived at the end of her life, the last 8 years of her life, the other great period of creative output for Jane Austen, I was there as the leader of a group of school teachers. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever led a group of school teachers on group travel. I'm guessing from the fact that you seem very relaxed and happy that you never have done that. But I was spending less time looking at Jane Austen's writing desk and more time trying to figure out if everybody was getting back in the right car and who was still in the tea room and all those sorts of things. So I went back to Chawton and I visited Jane Austen's house, but I also visited the house down the street that had belonged to her brother. Chawton, her brother Edward Austen, was like a character in Downton Abbey. He was adopted by very wealthy, childless, distant cousins to be their heir and to inherit their estates, including the Chawton estate, at which time, once he inherited that, he was able to invite his unmarried sisters and his widowed mother to come and live in a cottage on the estate. He primarily lived down in Kent, but he came up to Chawton on a regular basis and stayed at this lovely manor house, Chawton House, which is now a library of women 18th century writers. It's got a fantastic collection of rare books in it. So I went to take the Tuesday afternoon tour. It was just me and 2 other people, and we walked into this one room and I saw this painting hanging on the wall. And I fell over in a dead faint, and they woke me up and they said, "What was wrong, sir?" And I said, "What's this painting?" And they said, "Well, that's a 1780 painting of Chawton House It's just you didn't recognize the house because it's painted from the side rather than from the front. And it was this lovely moment to realize that the design people at my publishers at Viking had not just slapped any old house on there. They had found a painting of a house that has a very close connection to Jane Austen. And as we imagine Jane Austen as a very young woman walking the grounds of Busbury Park, we can know that Jane Austen, as she moved towards the end of her short life, did walk the grounds of the house that we see on the front cover. So there are other lovely details on the cover of the book that you will discover as you go along. One of them is this tiny little water stain. I'm not going to tell you what it means, but I will tell you that before you're finished with the book, you'll go, man, that's so cool that they put that water stain on the front cover. Just before I ask you to ask me questions, so this is a good time to be thinking up your questions, because I will call on you if you don't ask me. And somebody's going to have to ask the first question, so just go ahead and think something up right now. I just want to say one thing about being an author. There is a lot of talk these days about how this is a really hard time, or the wrong time to be an author. The bookstores are closing, and publishers are merging, and voices can't be heard because all the money is spent on 3 or 4 people. And I suppose that's probably true. But I happen to think that this is a really great time to be an author, maybe the best time ever to be an author. Because to me, what I'm really trying to do for you is to tell you a story. The biggest complaint I got about The Bookman's Tale, and I've already had one person give me the same complaint about First Impressions, is this. Charlie, I was going to try to get some work done this weekend, and then I picked your book up, and then it was Sunday. I'm okay with that. I want you to experience a good story. But to me, storytelling always goes back to my early experiences with storytelling as a child, sitting around a campfire or sitting around the living room of a mountain house and just telling stories. And storytelling was a circular occupation. And the opportunity that we have as authors to be a part of that circularity is greater now than it's ever been before, not just because I can come and talk to you, and I'll be talking to some other people in Phoenix and in San Diego and other places, and all the people on the internet that I can talk to, but that you can tweet to me, you can post on my Facebook page, you can send me an email, you can write me a letter. There are so many ways that authors can be connected to their readers. And it's lovely to take this stone that is the story that I want to tell you and heave it out into this pond and get the wonderful experience of seeing the waves lap up against the shore a little while later. I'll give you a couple of examples while you're thinking of these incisive questions that you're going to ask me. I've had 2 different people write to me and say, Charlie, I'm in library science school, and I couldn't figure out what I wanted to specialize in. And then I read The Bookman's Tale, and so now I'm going to specialize in rare books. And I think it is so cool that for the rest of their lives, those people will be able to say, if it wasn't for Charlie Lovett, I could be making a decent living. But one thing, if you haven't read The Bookman's Tale, it's the story, it's about Shakespeare and forgery and murder and love and all kinds of juicy things. But it's also the protagonist is a young man who has been recently widowed. And he's quite broken at the beginning of the book. And the book is really the story of him, not him healing, but him at least getting to a point where he could see beginning to enter back into the mainstream of life. And so that's sort of his character arc. And every now and then, I get lots of letters from readers, and they're usually fun to read. And I don't mind if they tell me the things that I did wrong. That's why if you have Bookman's Tale in hardback, you should pick it up in paperback, because we fixed all the things that were wrong in the paperback. A friend of mine wrote to me, he said, you have a character walking into the glass and steel enclosure of Paddington Station. I think it's wrought iron. And I looked it up. He was right. It was wrought iron. That was my bad. We fixed it. So you do have those little things. So you can write me and tell me all the things I did wrong. But every once in a while, those little waves that come lapping onto the shore of the pond, every once in a while, there's a big one that just hits you right in the heart. And I'm just going to read you a couple of emails that I've gotten from people who connected in a way that I never expected to the story that I sent out there. I'm 55 years old and have been reading for most of my life. This is the first time I've ever written to an author. I've just finished The Bookman's Tale and wanted to tell you you've given me some of the most pleasurable hours in my life. What a story. The most touching character was young Amanda. She reminded me of my wife, who I lost at a young age due to cancer. A very proper lady, poised and beautiful. I laughed and wept. Books and their stories do touch us. You have touched us. I wish I could write to you more eloquently to express what I'm feeling. I thought it was pretty eloquent myself. And then this one. Thank you for The Bookman's Tale. On many levels, I needed this book as a distraction. I'm a widow, about as long as Peter. My husband was a book collector, especially Jack London first editions. I was an English major and a librarian. We hung out at antiquarian book fairs around the country. I started the book 2 days ago after meeting to select a headstone for my husband's grave. I finished it the next day. For me, the widow, it was cathartic and loving and healing and not simply a distraction. I'm so thankful I chose to read it at this moment. It was so much more than a good story for me, and I thank you profoundly for having created it. Now, I know there are people in the world who have been equally affected by something that was written by Jane Austen, for instance, and she never got to hear from them. I think it's really cool that I get to hear from them. So I'm very happy to be an author in 2014. I thank you for coming. I thank you for having me. And I would love to answer some questions. And if you don't ask them, then I will just make you ask them. So yes, there's a question over here. Okay, great.
Did they print your initials on the cover this time?
They did. They did print my initials on the cover this time. They're in bronze this time. So I've been downgraded from gold down to bronze. I skipped silver somewhere along the way. But you know, it was what he's alluding to is I'm really into physical books, as you might know. You may have figured this out. And so when I got the hardcover copy of The Bookman's Tale, there's a scene in The Bookman's Tale where Peter binds a book for his then girlfriend, Amanda. And the last thing he does is he stamps her initials in gold on the front of the binding. So when I got my hardcover copy of The Bookman's Tale, I was excited to look at it. I said, I wonder what the binding looks like. So I carefully pulled the dust jacket back, and there on the front cover were my initials stamped in gold. Now, to me, that's a great example of the kind of triangular relationship that we can have between reader and text and a book as a physical object. And of course, when you see something like that, you do two things. You thank your publisher because it's such a warm and moving thing. And then you run to your local bookstore and you look to see if, like Stephen King or James Patterson or any of those people have their, and they don't have their initials on the cover. So if you're wondering why my initials are on the cover of First Impressions, that's why. Apparently that's my thing now. So, yes?
How old were you when you first read Jane Austen and knew that you were...
Therein lies the tale. Oh, first read or knew that I liked? Because those are two very different questions. So, okay, true confessions here. When I was in 7th grade, I went through this very sort of pompous period of thinking, I should be reading more grown-up books. I get good grades in English. And so I first read Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, which if you're a 7th grader, it's a little salacious, you know, and I thought, this is good. I'm liking this whole grown-up books thing. So then I read Pride and Prejudice, because my father taught Jane Austen. I mean, he didn't teach her personally. He's not quite that old. But, and I don't know who Jane Austen's imagined audience for Pride and Prejudice was when she wrote it, but I think it's a pretty good guess that 12-year-old boys of the 1970s in America were probably not the target audience. I did not get it. I felt pretty much the way what Eric says in the bar, that it was a soap opera. I didn't get. So I didn't come back to Jane Austen until I was a theater major in college, so I don't think I read any Jane Austen in college. And so I was probably 30 when I came back and read, I believe I came back first to Pride and Prejudice. I was like, this is hilarious. This is so funny and so well put together. And by then I knew a lot more about writing and about books, and I had developed a sense of humor, which apparently I didn't have when I was 12 years old. And so then I really, you know, I over the years I've read the novels at different times and in different places. I like Sophie, I love to read them in the English countryside, you know. But at 12 I wasn't quite ready yet. So. Other questions? No? Yeah.
Do you think you're going to continue using literary figures as the centers of your books?
Well, certainly for the next one for sure. The next book is coming out probably about a year from now, and will be a Christmas book. It is a sequel to Charles Dickens' famous book, A Christmas Carol, written as if by Charles Dickens. So I'm kind of doing my impersonation of Charles Dickens. And I actually wrote the book about 10 years ago. This shows you the vagaries of publishing. And I had an agent who was all excited about it, and he sent it out to several people who wrote really lovely rejection letters. And then, you know, sort of that was it. And so, oh well, try again, you know, and so it went into the bottom of the drawer, and then you get a book on the bestseller list, and you're sitting in your editor's office, and she says, what else you got? I told her some ideas about the next book, and I said, oh, I have this Christmas book. She's like, I'd be very interested in seeing that. So they're going to try to get an illustrator. I hope it'll be an illustrator who will do some things in kind of a Victorian style. We are looking at a couple of different possibilities right now. So it'll be sort of a little slim. It's really a long story more than it is a novella even, but I think it'll be fun. And I think people who like Dickens will recognize a lot of things in there, you know, whole sentences stolen out of David Copperfield and things like that. It was great fun to kind of take all of Dickens, what I knew about Dickens, which was not a gigantic amount, but, you know, and sort of try to put it into a lighthearted sequel to that book. And then the novel I'm working on right now that I was taking notes on while I sat on my balcony up in Vero Beach this morning is in its early stages, but it's set in an English cathedral library. So it'll be dealing with sort of medieval manuscripts and ancient illuminations and those kinds of things. And the great thing about that setting is that, you know, peril works really well in fiction if you want to have interesting things happen. And there's been lots of key moments of peril in English cathedrals over the last millennium. You know, you had your Vikings, and then you had your Normans, and then you had your Reformers, and you had your Civil War, and then finally you had your Blitz, you know. And so there's lots of opportunities to kind of talk about one of the things that I like to talk about, which is I love old books, and I'm fascinated by how they got here, and not how we sort of connect with not just with the past, but with individual people in the past through old books, but also the stories of how a particular old book survived 1,000 years of peril, or in this case of this book, this is 1797, so, you know, a couple of hundred years of maybe not Nazi bombs, but who knows what this book went through in the last 200 years. So that fascinates me, and being in that particular setting gives an opportunity to sort of plunge down that rabbit hole a little bit. So I think it'll be fun. It's early stages, but I like my two main characters so far. To me, I have to like them to want to spend time with them. And people have said of the characters in this book, they said, well, they're very likable characters. I'm like, I don't want to spend 4 months writing a draft of somebody that I don't like, you know. So you're not going to find. I mean, I'm not going to say I don't have bad guys. Sure, of course I have bad guys, but. Yeah.
That's Geraldine.
Yes.
I was hearing one author speak on whether an author should travel to different places they're writing about, and his basic response was, oh, well, Jane Austen was 10 times a writer as Robert Louis Stevenson, and she never left the house. That's what he had to say. So is that relatively
well,
accurate?
I mean, I suppose that's one way to look at it. Was she a better author because she didn't leave the house, or was she a better author because she was Jane Austen? I think that I personally find I find a real connection between place and story, and so it helps me. I mean, I was in Steventon for 30 minutes maybe, but that really helped me to write those scenes that were set in rural Hampshire, and just the sort of feeling of the country. It wasn't even necessarily that I was writing something specific about what I saw there, but it just helped me to kind of get into the zone that was, you know, 18th century Hampshire. Jane Austen wrote about a lot of things that happened inside the house too, you know. So to be perfectly fair, she did a lot of the things that she writes about in her novels. She went to balls, she went on visits, she went on walks in the countryside. She perhaps even had flirtations. So I think it's not quite right to say that Jane Austen didn't know what she was writing about because she stayed in the house all the time. But, you know, for me, one of the things I think that helped make my first novel successful, and that seems to come through in the second novel, is that I'm writing about the things that I love, that I care about. And that's old books and the world of English literature and the world of the English countryside. I spend time there and I love being there. And so it's what I want to write about. And it helps me to write about it because I've been there. But the reason I want to write about it is because I've been there. So it's sort of a circular thing for me. I'm not going to the English countryside just because I want to write a book there. I'm writing a book because I already love being there, you know. Yes?
Do you have a very favorite book?
Oh gosh. You know, well, I have like 8,000 copies or something. I don't know. I have many, many, many copies of Alice in Wonderland in my house. If you need a copy in, like, I don't know, Swahili or Urdu, I can set you up. But, you know, for me, it's like saying, I've never been into sort of having a favorite movie or a favorite song, or because it's all about what kind of a mood I'm in, you know, and when I was a teenager, I started every summer. Usually we lived in a house in the very remote part of the mountains in the summertime, and we had a few shelves of books. And I usually started every summer with either The Hobbit or Huck Finn, or if it was rainy in June, both. And I love that. My dad and I would read out loud certain passages from Huck Finn and just be rolling on the floor laughing at his wit and his humor. But there's just too many books in the world to have a favorite, though. Yeah.
Is it difficult? Your books are almost one-offs. In other words, they're not characters that move from one book to the next.
No, I haven't written a trilogy yet.
Yeah,
No.
is this a problem for you as an author? Because a lot of the
No,
books
I don't
these
think
days-
so, because to me, I mean, my agent actually advised me not to make this book a sequel, and I think it was very good advice. And he advised me to, when I told him the idea for the book, he said, "Your hero needs to be female," and I was like, "Duh." But I needed him to tell me that. You know, it's good to have good advice. I really didn't want to write a sequel to The Bookman's Tale, and here's why. Peter has been through a lot. The hero of The Bookman's Tale. He's lost his wife, and he's been through a very harrowing adventure. And he's finally kind of getting to a calm place in his life, a place of peace and a place of healing. And a story is about a character who has to overcome obstacles. And I'm sorry, but I just don't have it in me right now to throw more obstacles at Peter Byerly. He's had enough obstacles for right now. So maybe later on, you know, I'll have a chance to do that. But no, because I really like inventing characters. To me, that's one of the really fun parts about it. I was a playwright for children for more than 10 years, and I loved inventing the characters and giving them the characteristics that made them unique individuals. And if I used characters that I've already invented, then half the fun of coming up with the book has already been done earlier. You know, so it doesn't bother me. I'm not currently planning a YA dystopian trilogy, but you know, never say never. You know. Well, thank you all for coming. It's been a real pleasure. I hope you enjoy the book.
Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. Thank you. I will say that the books are for sale behind the counter, and since Charlie's Books is going to be one of those ones that's worth $10,000, you might want to buy 3 or 4 copies a piece now. So, and if you're watching online, give us a call here at the store. We'll get one signed. We'll ship it to you. Thanks so much for being here.